Chapter 3. Lorena had never lived in a place where it was cool. It was her one aim. It seemed to her she had learned to sweat at the same time she had learned to breathe, and she was still doing both. Of all the places she'd heard men talk about, San Francisco sounded the coolest and nicest, so it was San Francisco she set her sights on. Sometimes it seemed like slow going. She was nearly 24 and hadn't got a mile past Lonesome Dove, which wasn't fast progress considering that she'd only been 12 when her parents got nervous about Yankees and left Mobile. That much slow progress would have discouraged most women, but Lorena didn't allow her mind to dwell on it. She had her flat days, of course, but that was mostly because Lonesome Dove itself was so flat. She got tired of looking out the window all day and seeing nothing but brown land and gray chaparral. In the middle of the day, the sun was so hot the land looked white. She could see the river from her window in Mexico. Mexico Lippy told her she could make a fortune if she cared to establish herself in Mexico, but Lorena didn't care to. From what she could see of the country, it didn't look any more interesting than Texas, and the men stunk just as bad as Texans, if not worse. Gus McRae claimed to have been to San Francisco and would talk to her for hours about how blue the water was in the bay and how the ships came in from everywhere. In the end, he over-talked it, like he did everything. Once or twice, Lorena felt she had a clear picture of it listening to Gus, but by the time he finally quit talking, she would have lost it and just be lying there, wishing it would cool off. In that respect, Gus was unusual, for most men didn't talk. He would blab right up until he shoved his old carrot in, and then he'd be blabbing again before it was even dry. Generous as he was by local standards, he gave her $5 in gold every single time. Lorena still felt a little underpaid. It should have been $5 for wetting his carrot and another $5 for listening to all his blab. Some of it was interesting, but Lorena couldn't keep her mind on so much talk. It didn't seem to hurt Gus's feelings any. He just talked as cheerful whether she was listening or not, and he never tried to talk her into giving him 2 pokes for the price of 1, as most of the younger men did. It was peculiar that he was her most regular customer because he was also her oldest. She made a point of not letting anything men did surprise her much, but secretly it did surprise her a little that a man as old as Gus would be so partial to it. In that respect, he put a lot of younger men to shame, including Mosby Marlin, who had her held up for 2 years over in East Texas. Compared to Gus, Mosby couldn't even be said to have a carrot, though he did have a kind of little stringy radish that he was far too proud of. She had only been 17 when she met Mosby, and both her parents were dead. Her pa fell out in Vicksburg, and her ma only made it to Baton Rouge, so it was Baton Rouge where she was stranded when Mosby found her. She'd only been 17 when she met Mosby, and both her parents were dead. Her pa fell out in Vicksburg, and her ma made it only to Baton Rouge, so it was Baton Rouge where she was stranded when Mosby found her. She hadn't done any sporting up to that point, though she had developed early and even had some trouble with her own pa, though he was feverish to the point of delirium when the trouble happened. He died soon after. She knew Mosby was a drunkard from the first, but he told her he was a Southern gentleman and he had an expensive buggy and a fine pair of horses, so she believed him. Mosby claimed that he wanted to marry her, and Lorena believed that too, and let him drag her off to a big old drafty house near a place called Gladwater. The house was huge, but it didn't even have glass in the windows or rugs or anything. They had to set smoke pots in the room just to keep the mosquitoes from eating them alive, which the mosquitoes did anyway. Mosby had a mother and 2 mean sisters and no money, and no intention of marrying Lorena anyway, though he kept claiming he would for a while. In fact, the women folk treated Lorena worse than they treated the Negras, and they didn't treat the Negras good. They didn't treat Mosby good either, or any other one good. About the only creatures they ever saw any kindness around that house was Mosby's hounds. Mosby assured her he'd set the hounds on her if she ever tried to run away. It was in the nights when Lorena had to lay there with the smoke from the smoke pot so thick she couldn't breathe, and the clouds of mosquitoes nearly as thick as the smoke, and Mosby constantly bothering her with his radish, that Lorena's spirits sunk so low she ceased to want to talk. She became a silent woman. Soon after the sporting started, because Mosby lost so much money one night that he offered 2 of his friends a poke in exchange for his debt. Lorena was so surprised that she didn't even have time to arm herself, and the 2 men had their way. But the next morning, when the 2 were gone, she went at Mosby with his own quirt and cut his face so badly they put her in a cellar for 2 days and didn't even bring her food. 2 or 3 months later, it happened again with some more friends, and this time Lorena didn't fight. She was too tired of Mosby and his radish and the smoke pots, and she was willing to consider anything different. The mother and the mean sisters wanted to drive her out of the house, and Lorena would have been glad to go, but Mosby threw such a fit that one of the sisters ran off herself to live with an aunt. Then one night, Mosby just plain sold a poke to a traveling man of some kind. He seemed to be planning to do it regular, only the second man he sold her to happened to take a fancy to Lorena. His name was John Tinkersley, the tallest and prettiest man Lorena had seen up to that point, and the cleanest. When he asked if she was really married to Mosby, she said no. Tinkersley suggested then and there that she accompany him to San Antonio. Lorena was glad to agree. Mosby was so shocked by her decision that he offered to go and get the preacher and marry her on the spot. But by that time, Lorena had figured out that being married to Mosby would be even worse than what she had already been through. Mosby tried for a while to work himself up to a fight, but he was no match for Tinkersley, and he knew it. The best he could salvage was to sell Tinkersley a horse for Lorena, plus a side saddle that belonged to the sister who had run off. San Antonio was a big improvement over Gladewater, if only because there was no smoke pots and few mosquitoes. They kept 2 rooms in the hotel, not the finest in town, but fine enough, and Tinkersley bought Lorena some pretty clothes. Of course, he financed that by selling the horse and the side saddle, which disappointed Lorena just a little. She had discovered that she liked riding. She would have been happy to ride on to San Francisco, but Tinkersley had no interest in that. Clean and tall and pretty as he was, turned out in the end to be no better bargain than Mosby. If he had a soft spot, it was for himself, not for her. He even spent money getting his fingernails cut, which was something Lorena had never dreamed a man would do. For all that, he was a hard man. Fighting with Mosby had been like fighting with a little boy, whereas the first time she talked back to Tinkersley, he hit her so hard her head cracked a washpot on the bureau behind her. Her ears rang for 3 days. He threatened to do worse than that, too, and Lorena didn't suppose that they were idle threats. She held her tongue around Tinkersley from then on. He made it clear that marriage wasn't what he had in mind when he took her away from Mosby, which was all right in itself since she had already got out of the habit of thinking about marriage. That didn't mean she was in the habit of thinking about herself as a sporting woman, but it was precisely the habit that Tinkersley expected her to acquire. "Well, you're already trained, ain't you?" he said. Lorena didn't consider what had happened in Gladewater any training for anything, but then it was clear there wasn't anything respectable that she was trained for, even if she could get away from Tinkersley without being killed. For a few days she had thought Tinkersley might love her, but he soon made it clear that she meant about as much to him as a good saddle. She knew that for the first time being the sporting life was about her only choice. At least the hotel room was nice and there was no mean sisters. Most of the sports who came to see her were men Tinkersley gambled with in the bar down below. Once in a while a nice one would give her a little money directly instead of leaving it with Tinkersley, but Tinkersley was smart enough about such things, and he found her hiding place and cleaned her out the day they took the stage to the Matamoros. He might have not done it if he hadn't had a string of losses, but the fact that he was handsome didn't mean that he was a good gambler, as several of the sports pointed out to Lorena. He was just a middling gambler. He had such a run of bad luck in San Antonio that he decided there might be less competition down on the border. It was on that trip that they had the real fight. Lorena felt swollen with anger about the money, swollen enough finally not to be scared of him. What she wanted was to kill him for being so determined to leave her with absolutely nothing. If she had known more about guns, she would have killed him. She thought with a gun you just pulled the trigger, but it turned out his had to be cocked first. Tinkersley was lying on the bed drunk, but not so drunk he didn't notice when she stuck his own gun in his stomach. When she realized it wasn't going to go off, she had just time to hit him in the face with it a lick that actually won the fight for her. Although before he gave up and went to look for a doctor to stitch up his jaw, Tinkersley did bite her on the upper lip as they were rolling around, Lorena still hoping the gun would shoot. The bite had left a faint little scar just above her upper lip. To Lorena's amusement, it was that trifling scar that seemed to make men crazy for a time with her. Of course, it wasn't just the scar. She had developed well and also gotten prettier as she'd gotten older. But the scar played its part. Tinkersley got drunk in Lonesome Dove the day he left her, and he told everyone in the dry bean that she was a murderous woman. So she had a reputation in town before she even unpacked her clothes. Tinkersley had left her with no money at all, but fortunately she could cook when she had to. The dry bean was the only place in Lonesome Dove that served food, and Lorena had been able to talk Xavier Wance, who owned it, into letting her do the cooking until the cowboys got over being scared of her and began to approach her. Augustus was the man who got it started. Well, he was pulling off his boots the first time he smiled at her. "Where'd you get that scar?" he asked. "Somebody bit me," Lorena said. Once Gus became a regular, she had no trouble making a living in the town, although in the summer when cowboys were mostly off on the trail, pickings sometimes did grow slim. While she was well past the point of trusting men, she soon perceived that Gus was in a class by himself, at least in Lonesome Dove. He wasn't mean, and he didn't treat her like most men treated a sporting woman. She knew he would probably even help her if she ever really needed help. It seemed to her he had got rid of something other men hadn't got rid of, some meanness or some need. He was the one man besides Lippy she would sometimes talk to, a little. With most of the sports she had nothing at all to say. In fact, her silence soon came to be wildly commented on. It was part of her, like the scar, and like the scar it drew men to her even though it made them deeply uneasy. It was not a trick either. Although she knew it unnerved the sports and made matters go quicker. Silent happened to be how she felt when men were with her. In respect to her silence, too, Gus McCrae was different. At first he seemed not to notice it. Certainly he didn't let it bother him. Then it began to amuse him, which was not a reaction Lorena had had from anyone else. Most men chattered like squirrels when they were with her, no doubt hoping she would say something back. Of course, Gus was a great blabber, but his blabbing wasn't really like the chattering the other sports did. He was just full of opinion, which he freely poured out, as much for his own amusement as for anything. Lorena had never particularly looked at life as if it was something funny, but Gus did. Even her lack of talk struck him as funny. One day he walked in and sat down in a chair, the usual look of amusement on his face. Lorena assumed he was going to take off his boots, and she went over to the bed. But when she looked around, he was sitting there, one foot on the other knee, twirling the rowel of his spur. He always wore spurs, although it was not often she saw him on horseback. Once in a while in the early morning, the bowling of cattle or the nickering of horses would awaken her, and she would look out the window and see him and his partner and a gang of riders trailing their stock through the low brush to the east of town. Gus was noticeable, since he rode a big black horse that looked like it could have pulled 3 stagecoaches by itself. But he kept his spurs on, even when he wasn't riding, so he would have them handy when he wanted something to jingle. "Them's the only musical instruments I ever learned to play," he told her once. Since he just sat there twirling his spurs and smiling at her, Lorena didn't know whether to get undressed or what. It was July, blistering hot. She had tried sprinkling the bed sheets, but the heat dried them some time before she could even lay down. "I God, it's hot," Gus said. "We could all be living in Canada just as cheap. I doubt I've even got the energy to set my post." Why come then, Lorena thought. Another unusual thing about Gus was that he could practically tell what she was thinking. In this case, he looked abashed and dug a $10 gold piece out of his pocket, which he pitched over to her. Lorena felt wary. It was $5 too much, even if he did decide to set his post. She knew old men got crazy sometimes and wanted strange things. Lippy was a constant problem. He had a hole in his stomach and could barely keep his piano playing up. But it turned out she had no need to worry about God. "I figured out something, Lori," he said. "I figured out why you and me get along so well. You know more than you say, and I say more than I know. That means we're a perfect match, as long as we don't hang around one another more than an hour at a stretch." It made no sense to Lorena, but she relaxed. There was no likelihood he would try anything crazy on her. "This is $10, she said, thinking maybe he hadn't noticed what kind of money he was handing over. "You know prices are funny," he said. "I've known a good many sporting girls, and I've always wondered why they didn't price more flexible. If I was in your place and I had to traipse upstairs with some of these old smelly sorts, I'd want a sight of money, whereas if I was some good-looking young sprout who kept himself barbered up, why, a nickel might be enough." Lorena remembered Tinkersley, who had had the use of her for 2 years, taken all she brought in, and then left her without a cent. "A nickel wouldn't be enough," she said. "I can do without the barber." But Augustus was in the mood for full discussion. "Say you put $2 as your low figure," he said. "That's for the well-barbered sprout. What would the high figure be for some big rank waddy who couldn't even spell? The point I'm making is that all men ain't the same, so they shouldn't be the same price, or am I wrong? Maybe from where you sit, all men are the same." Once she thought about it, Lorena saw his point. All men weren't quite the same. A few were nice enough that she might notice them, and a goodly few were mean enough that she couldn't help but notice them. But the majority were neither one nor the other. They were just men. They left money, no memories. So far it was the only mean ones who had left the memories. "Why'd you give me this 10? She asked, willing to be a little curious, since it seemed it was going to be just talk anyway. "Hoping to get you to talk a minute," Augustus said, smiling. He had the most white hair she'd ever seen on a man. He mentioned once that it had turned white when he was 30, making his life more dangerous since the Indians would have considered the white scalp a prize. "I was married twice, you remember," he said. "She would have been married a third time, but the woman made a mistake and didn't marry me." "What's that got to do with this money?" Lorena asked. "Pint is, I ain't a natural bachelor," Augustus said. "There's days when a little bit of talk with a female is worth any price. I figured the reason you don't have much to say is you probably never met a man who liked to hear a woman talk. Listening to women ain't the fashion in this part of the country, but I expect you got a life story like everybody else. If you'd like to tell it, I'm the one that'd like to hear it." Lorena thought that over. Gus didn't seem uncomfortable. He just sat there, twirling his rowel. "In these parts, what business is all about is women's company anyway," he said. "Now, in a cold climb, it might be different. Cold climb will perk a boy up, make him want to wiggle his bean, but down here in this heat, it's mostly company they're after." There was something to that. Men looked at her sometimes like they wished she would be their sweetheart, the young ones particularly, but some of the old ones too. One or two had even wanted to let her keep her, though where they meant to do the keeping she didn't know. She was already living in the only spare room in Lonesome Dove. Little marriages were what they wanted, just something that would last until they started up the trail. Some girls did it that way, hitched up with one cowboy for a month or 6 weeks and got presents and played at being respectable. She had known girls who did it that way in San Antonio. The thing that struck her was that the girls seemed to believe it as much as the cowboys did. They would act just as silly as respectable girls, getting jealous of one another and pouting all day if their boys didn't act to suit them. Lorena had no interest in conducting things that way. The men who came to see her would have to realize that she was not interested in play acting. After a bit, she decided she wasn't interested in telling Augustus her life story either. She buttoned her dress back up and handed him the $10. "It ain't worth $10, she said, "even if I could remember it all." Augustus stuck the money back in his pocket. "I ought to know better than to try and buy conversation," he said, grinning. "Let's go down and play some cards."
Oh, Cindy.